Okay, should probably get started. So I want to welcome everyone to the second last seminar in our online lecture series on resource struggles in international law under occupation, convened by myself, Julia Dem, and my colleagues Sahiba Mukwal and Caitlin Murphy. Before introducing our speaker, we want to acknowledge that we're joining this seminar from occupied land and that struggles for land justice, for water justice, and resource justice continue across this continent. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the rightful owners of the land on which I'm joining this call, that their land was stolen and their sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
So this online lecture series seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historically inflected discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. So this semester we've been focusing on resource struggles in the context of occupation around the world, and we've collectively explored how struggles over resource plunder and exploitation shape the dynamics of occupation and how peoples under occupation are contesting extraction and asserting ownership and sovereignty over resources as part of broader resistance movements. So speakers are examining resource struggles under occupation in Greenland, West Papua, Palestine, Kashmir, Bougainville, and Western Sahara to consider the different forms of political contestation that they produce and how resource struggles might be mobilized to enliven political possibilities for self-determination and decolonization.
We are delighted to have such a wonderful line of speakers, as well as Dr. Randi Irwin, who we will hear from today. We will also have a final lecture from Dr. Hadil Abu Hussein on Palestine, and you can have access to recordings of many of our previous lectures on our website. And details of these other lectures are available in the chat.
I'm now delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Randi Irwin received her PhD in sociocultural anthropology in 2019 from the New School for Social Research in New York. She's an environmental and legal anthropologist working with the Sahrawi refugee community in North Africa, and she draws on this research to inform her teaching in anthropology, social change, and development at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. At its core, her research attends to the intersections of resource extraction, land rights, and the intersections of protest and law. Her primary research, which was funded by the US National Science Foundation, was conducted with Sahrawi refugees and the Sahrawi state-in-exile. This work is focused on Sahrawi-led political and legal challenges to natural resource exploitation in Western Sahara as part of broader strategies to bring about the territory's decolonisation as it remains the last colony in Africa. Her research is the first to focus on Sahrawi-led natural resource contracts as a mode of projecting a future, decolonised Western Sahara, and puts forth a research practice focused on economic strategies that build a near future with a different territorial and political configuration. Thanks so much for speaking to us today. Randi, over to you. She'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll have some time for questions.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Let me share my slides so everyone should be able to see that, I hope. Is that the case? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about Western Sahara and Sahrawi-led strategies for managing natural resources in the territory. There are a range of ways in which I could talk to you about all of these strategies, their possibilities, and their limitations, and maybe we can do some of that in the discussion component. What I'm going to focus on today is a bit of the Sahrawi struggle that tends to get much less attention. At times, this is felt like a promising and optimistic site in the broader struggle for decolonization. Certainly, it's one of the more creative sites. So today, I'll focus on how Sahrawis have sought to use natural resources, profiting from them politically and financially from exile, and in anticipation of decolonization. This strategy, led by the Sahrawi state, is just one of the many ways that Sahrawis, as the indigenous peoples of the territory, have sought to exercise their claims to Western Sahara, while challenging the Moroccan occupation. Sahrawi representatives have successfully used legal challenges in courts in Europe and South Africa to block the Moroccan state's extraction of the territory's resources, while Sahrawi youth have run divestment campaigns and sought to engage directly with companies leading the work. Across contexts, the focus has been on the failure of the Moroccan state to operate in line with the interests and wishes of the people of Western Sahara, Sahrawis, and that's a requirement affirmed by the UN legal opinion. Sahrawis must work to constantly assert their identity and their rights, to prove that they weren't consulted and that they won't benefit from the Moroccan-led extraction. Today, I want to show how Sahrawis have used law to construct liberated and decolonized futures that extend beyond present-based struggles to block the Moroccan state's extractive operations in the colonized meantime. So I'll turn to this now. She's our only pilot. We have a woman pilot, but she's a pilot without a plane. It was the second day of my fieldwork in the Sahrawi refugee camps outside of Tindouf, Algeria. Over the span of 2 years, my fieldwork would take me to the United Kingdom, France, Spain, Australia, and the United States, in addition to multiple trips to the Sahrawi refugee camps. Studying a state in exile and the political protest movements led by refugees required far broader traversing than I first anticipated. As I sat on a plastic lawn chair inside of a large concrete hall in the middle of the Sahrawi camp of Smara, a reference to a town by the same name in Western Sahara, a young man named Sidi Ahmed directed my eyes towards the singular pilot, whose Sahrawi identity was clearly marked by the milfa she wore. Sidi Ahmed laughed, asking, "What good is it to have a pilot when we don't have a plane?" He suggested that this was the reality of Sahrawi life after living nearly 45 years in the refugee camps. Preparation followed by the frustrating reality that Sahrawi youth study and train for careers that cannot be carried out and for which they cannot be compensated so long as they live in the camps. On the day that Sidi Ahmed pointed out the Sahrawi pilot, he and I were both in attendance at the opening of the 2015 Women's Congress. At the Congress, I would hear representatives from the Sahrawi refugee camps, Algeria, and South Africa emphasize the strength of the Sahrawi state. At first glance, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic appeared to be much like the case of the pilot without a plane. In the absence of clear territorial rights and uncontested sovereignty, the Sahrawi state appears to be a government absent a physical state, and yet prepared to one day exercise its craft. The Sahrawi state governs its citizens from the Sahrawi refugee camps, but does not have exclusive access to its territory and resources. Oops, sorry. Oh, I lost my photos. Sorry, just a second. There we go. Okay. So while the Sahrawi state claims sovereignty over Western Sahara, it only has access to 20% of the non-self-governing territory, of which the remaining 80% has been controlled by the Moroccan state, which you can see outlined here. Morocco has access to the left of the dotted line, and Sahrawis have access to the right of the dotted line. So the Moroccan state entered the territory upon Spain's departure from the Spanish Sahara in 1975. A war between Morocco and Sahrawi forces continued until the UN-brokered ceasefire in 1991, which promised to bring about a referendum on self-determination to the people of Western Sahara. However, the referendum has yet to eventuate. More than 3 decades after the promised referendum, the UN-led process appears to be at a stalemate, and just this month, the UN Security Council has shifted its language on the credibility and viability of the Moroccan-backed autonomy plan. And that merits its own extended commentary, which we might be able to discuss after I finish speaking. So for now, I'm just going to focus on how Sahrawis have sought to construct political possibilities and opportunities for action, rejecting Morocco's long-time proposal for autonomy as an alternative to decolonization. I'll do this through a focus on the Sahrawi state, its legal regimes, and its natural resource markets, as they build opportunities for the international recognition of the state. Through an examination of the Sahrawi state's use of deferred natural resource contracts, I'll highlight Sahrawi political action occurring prior to and in anticipation of the referendum. Through these contracts, the territory and its potential oil and gas are bundled as assets held by international companies, but deferred until sovereignty is attained. Through a focus on the Sahrawi-led deferred natural resource contracts, I'll show how the state works to simultaneously produce itself and its sovereignty within the contracts, and as part of a political project for decolonization. These Sahrawi-led contracts produce different temporal orientations that necessitate and enable new legal and financial regulations. These contracts mediate the construction of opportunities in the present based on the sovereign futures that they project. Importantly, they offer the possibility to prepare for and action sovereignty in ways that extend beyond the contracts and their mediation of Sahrawi property, which is the main focus of what follows. So, Sahrawi officials invoke the contracts as a method for building systems, policies, and practices that are seen as fundamental to the responsibilities of a sovereign state. So, I want to focus on the production of mechanisms to govern the property and wealth of the state. And in doing so, I ask, how are these contracts, which sell possible access to property not yet possessed, invoked as evidence of the Sahrawi state's readiness to govern and its commitment to the spirit of international law? To answer this, I'll briefly introduce and explain the structure of Sahrawi natural resource contracts before examining the production and valuation of markets in Western Sahara's resources. I'll close with an examination of the political work of making and managing Sahrawi sovereignty as the principal source of value that transforms and is transformed by practices of financialization. So, first, a bit about the contracts. Sahrawi government officials have worked to actively construct the Sahrawi state's territory and sovereignty in a way that enables the potential state's property to be actionable and subject to use before the full recognition of sovereignty is achieved. The Sahrawi Republic has developed two different ways of utilizing resources and generating property. One is deferred oil and gas exploration agreements and currently actionable mineral exploration agreements. The two forms offer both present and future economic opportunities, while also delineating parcels of public and private property. I'll focus on the deferred contracts to examine how they have been used as a preparatory tool for the assertion of sovereignty, while simultaneously offering present-day financial opportunities in the presence of uncontested land rights. In the absence of uncontested land rights. So, while the Moroccan state's presence and control over the majority of Western Sahara prevents the Sahrawi state from exercising full physical control over Western Sahara, it has nonetheless offered these natural resource contracts for land across the Moroccan-occupied portion of the territory. The Sahrawi Petroleum and Mining Authority has marked out 18 uniquely parceled blocks of the territory and its offshore waters. These blocks cover nearly all of Western Sahara. The Sahrawi-led contracts offer a way for Sahrawi leadership to mediate property and time, specifically the time until the Sahrawi Republic is fully recognized as sovereign, a period which is described by the Petroleum and Mining Authority as the, quote, intervening period of deferral. Following the first round of licensing blocks in 2005-2006, the Sahrawi State's Petroleum and Mining Authority announced they had secured agreements for 10 blocks held by 6 different companies. In contrast to the oil and gas companies who have agreements with the Moroccan state, the companies awarded Sahrawi oil and gas licenses have not yet entered the territory. Instead, Sahrawi-led contracts are bridged by assurance agreements, intended to hold the licenses in a state of deferral until sovereignty is attained, or for a period of up to 10 years with the opportunity for renewal. The contracts, when paired with the assurance agreements, are legally viable and outline the mutual requirements of both parties in a circumstance in which competing claims to sovereignty and territorial control might raise questions about their viability. So what you see right now on the slide is the Moroccan contracts that have been offered on the left and the Sahrawi contracts on the right. And you'll see that these overlay in the same spaces. So the Sahrawi agreements outline two contracts, the Sahrawi agreements outline two conditions, which must be achieved by the Sahrawi state in order to activate the contracts. The state must achieve sovereign recognition from the United Nations and be admitted to the UN General Assembly. Additionally, the state must have a tax law before the contracts are activated. So, while the Sahrawi state has not yet achieved universally recognized sovereignty, it now has a tax law. The companies holding these contracts have their own obligations outlined by the agreements. According to publicly available materials from the 2008 license offering, the assurance agreement requires 2 annual fees, an administrative fee and a social contribution. annual payments form part of the responsibilities of contract holders and connect them to their respective plots. Thus, agreements enable the licenses to be held for the future, deferring exploration and exploitation while simultaneously marking out and selling Sahrawi blocks in the colonized meantime. These blocks become mobile as virtual property and are rendered actionable in a speculative market that anticipates a sovereign Sahrawi future. Mobility at a time when the resources in question are entirely outside of the physical possession of the state. So, through Sahrawi-led deferred contracts, we have a delay until Sahrawi sovereignty is attained. But the contracts still circulate within networks of exchange while anticipating a sovereign future. These contracts offer a profoundly different opportunity for amplifying knowledge that counters the territory's configuration under the control of the Moroccan state. So here I follow Catherine Verdery, who proposes that all property making, including our own, is not natural, but a historical and political process. I do not take property in Western Sahara as a given, but rather look to the social, legal, and economic processes that make property, establish its boundaries, and allocate it based on a set of rights, while also expanding the epistemologies that make property and possession legible. The Sahrawi contracts contrast with the Moroccan-led contracts. While they utilize the same physical territory of Western Sahara, the configuration of the territory is remade through Sahrawi histories, legal strategies, and political claims rooted in the decolonization struggle. Via the contracts, Western Sahara is territorialized as the Sahrawi state. Its property is packaged for later use with term limits attached and options for renewal. Yet, the delay and deferral within the design of these contracts does not mean that the assets are stagnant or frozen. Contracts and their corresponding virtual property have even been sold or traded between companies. Their mobility is key as they enable the marking out and circulation of Sahrawi property as an exercise of sovereignty. The contracts do more than generate cash in the anticipation of sovereignty. They are explicitly invoked by Sahrawi leaders as necessary preparatory work for the state. So circulation, whether through state-mediated financial technologies or state-owned commodities like camels, offers Sahrawis an opportunity to extend the reach and inscription of the Sahrawi territory. The mobility of virtual property enabled by these contracts prior to full sovereignty might be best understood as functioning like a financial derivative. In finance-focused markets, contracts are bought and sold based on an assessment of the value of the asset at a given point in the future. So, what is this future value which becomes the foundation of future-based transactions and works to actively stabilize the expectations of future-based contracts in Western Sahara? In a context like Western Sahara, where possession is not immediately legible in the forms normally demanded by legal norms and resource markets, it's worth turning to examine the promise and how it is configured. In this case, the promise is that of Sahrawi sovereignty. These deferred oil and gas contracts and their subsequent financialized payments produce other ways of making and promising political possibilities for an as yet unrealized future. In Western Sahara, the implementation of the deferred oil contracts has generated new social, political, and economic forms that create a political terrain, transforming otherwise inaccessible, seemingly off-limits resources into productive spaces of opportunity in the present through their projection of a different future. Over the last 2 decades, Sahrawis have expanded on their earlier history of state building to create new forms of territorial control essential for their political future. It's worth noting that the relationships and promises that made these contracts possible were forged during a period when a referendum seemed imminent. However, these expectations have receded, and a timeline on the referendum seems far less predictable, as negotiations have stalled and the 1991 UN-brokered ceasefire collapsed in 2020. Yet, despite the decades of delay and the geopolitical shifts, the Sahrawi-led pursuit of natural resource extraction is ongoing. While sovereignty might not yet be achieved, the virtual property of the not yet fully sovereign state has been able to circulate with a level of valuation on both the underlying assets and the anticipated Sahrawi state. Here, hydrocarbons that are not yet possessed become financial assets, circulating as claims to rights in the present granted by a state defined by its promissory status. But these contracts do more than move virtual property. They offer insight into broader Sahrawi strategies for furthering sovereignty and enabling political action in conjunction with configurations of property, territory, and citizenship in the meantime. Sahrawi contracts are simply not viable, even in their deferral, without the associated configuration of historical rights and contemporary citizenship. So, while the Sahrawi state may appear to be like the pilot absent a plane, the creation of these contracts helps to identify how the state has sought to build and maintain its citizens, territory, and laws in virtual and material ways. Setting out on this research, I characterized these contracts as innovative, but when I spoke to Sahrawis, such a characterization was rejected altogether. The Sahrawi youth with whom I spent most of my time during my 2015 and 2017 trips to the refugee camps saw the contracts as simply part of what a responsible state should do to hone their expertise. Why wouldn't the Sahrawi state manage their resources? It was all just a state preparing to be a state by doing things like a state. So while in the camps, I constantly sought out the contracts. They were my object of inquiry. Surely they would be held in the archives, a great suggestion offered by one of my friends. So she arranged for a driver, and off we went to the Sahrawi State's archives. However, a helpful archivist staffing the office was unable to produce them. As I explained my reason for my interest in the contracts, I inadvertently drew the staff member's ire when I referred to the Sahrawi state as a state in waiting. In a quick and incisive corrective, he explained that the Sahrawi state was not waiting. It was already a state, regardless of whether the UN facilitated the referendum. I apologized, and he suggested that if I wanted to find out more about the contracts, I should go elsewhere. This correction evidences the social and political configurations performed through his assertion of contemporary Sahrawi sovereignty that both enables and is reaffirmed by the valuation that makes deferred contracts possible. While evidence of the Sahrawi state seemed to be everywhere, the contracts continued to escape my ethnographic pursuits. I grew nervous as my searches failed to produce the contracts, though they did perpetually produce evidence of the state that underwrites their value. As time went on, it became clear that I was not going to find the contracts in the camps. I'd expected that finding a copy of the contracts would tell me what I needed to know. I could analyze their form and the legal and financial techniques deployed, which I anticipated would be unique. But this expectation of uniqueness was a point of concern and confusion amongst Sahrawis. As the archivist emphasized, Sahrawis are not passively waiting for the international community. They're acting in line with the sovereign recognition they receive from several countries and the African Union. When I turned my attention to the Sahrawi state's globally dispersed representative network, the political and bureaucratic infrastructure that has enabled the contracts became apparent. In cafes, hotel lobbies, and restaurants scattered across the United States, France, Spain, and Australia, I found their sites of production. Following an annual meeting between the Petroleum and Mining Authority and contract holders in Paris, I had the opportunity to meet with some of those involved. It was here that I found high-ranking Sahrawi political representatives, their lawyers, and those working for natural resource companies that held an interest in accessing Western Sahara via the Sahrawi state. In my conversations with Sahrawis across these different positionalities, the natural resource contracts were seen to be both normative and political acts that the state offered as opportunities to build sovereignty. In these spaces, the contracts were a pathway to establishing a larger profile and building credibility internationally. Throughout my fieldwork, youth activists and Sahrawi state officials alike emphasized the state's capabilities. They saw the banality of the contracts as a bureaucratic necessity within a larger project of building the state's legitimacy. Finance as a practice was simply a necessary component of statecraft. The contracts were perceived to further assert the Sahrawi state's ability to serve as a good business partner in a global market. For Sahrawi officials, the primary objective was to counter Morocco's subsumption of Western Sahara, while simultaneously demonstrating the Sahrawi state's readiness to govern, which officials sought to prove through the forms of recognition, valuation, and legitimacy embedded in the contracts. For Sahrawis, what was perhaps most important was the mediation of the Sahrawi state, its qualities and properties through global financial mechanisms that standardize and set the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. It was not uncommon for leaders to make the link between finance, the contracts, and broader pathways for recognition. In an interview about the contracts, an official quickly pivoted to discuss what he referred to as the political track and the difficulties that he saw in a pathway through the UN Security Council that had been willing to accept the ongoing delay in the referendum. For one official, the stalled political track could be juxtaposed with economic tracks that offered promise and a means to enhance the sovereignty of the Sahrawi state. As one official said, to quote, prepare our future of the Sahrawi independent state with experience. Here, creating the sort of institutional relationships that work as sites of valuation. Sahrawi officials have worked to establish the potential future state as a trustworthy partner on the right side of international law and with the ability to manage financial relationships in an investment-worthy way. Evoking Horatio Ortiz's focus on standardization, the contracts provide an opportunity to normalize international financial relations. The Sahrawi state has sought to use these contracts to practice business operations in a way that they hope establishes the state as experienced, skilled, and trustworthy, minimizing the perceived risks of doing business once sovereignty is attained. So I want to now turn to how these promises and expectations are stabilized in the contracts. And as evidenced in the Sahrawi contracts, practices of financialization can be implemented in situations characterized by high risk and high uncertainty, where property is not possessed in the most standard sense, something particularly important for non-self-governing territories and displaced populations. I suggest the financialization of the market and natural resources in Western Sahara offers an opportunity to explore how the valuation of financial products coincides with the enhancement of claims to possessing an established and credible governance structure for the future state. As Donald Mackenzie has argued in his writing on derivatives, virtual assets are virtual in the sense that their value lies not in their physical substances, but in the claims on the future states of the world that they embody. The production of facts and claims via the Sahrawi-led market enables the production of virtual contracts, and as such demands interrogation to examine how Sahrawi sovereignty and property are produced, stabilized, and circulated as fundamental to the valuation of the market in Western Sahara's natural resources. While the Sahrawi state may not physically possess the land plots on which the contracts are based, the contracts and the property they mediate are materially produced and no less real. For a Sahrawi-led Western Sahara, the anticipated asset or commodity, the territory, becomes actionable through sales, trades, and markets prior to its sovereign delivery. Unlike the future market in grains, commodities, or mortgages, in which the speculator knows the date when the price is to be calculated, the deferred oil and gas contracts have no known future date, as they require and anticipate sovereignty one day. These forms of anticipation and preparation demand consideration to examine how they shape the contract's viability and the political and economic opportunities that they afford. Much like other derivative contracts in well-established financial markets, the Sahrawi-led deferred contracts provide a method for bundling property and commoditizing it based on a future anticipated state, giving companies the opportunity to exercise the option to explore and extract resources should that sovereign future be attained. I suggest that the contracts, as financial derivatives, rely on official Sahrawi discourse and an economy of words to create possibilities for valuing the future state for the state to establish its expectations for a decolonized future, while asserting claims about the quality of the Sahrawi state's economic policies and its commitment to capitalism. This allows the state to project the value of the contracts and the qualities of the anticipatory sovereignty they partially mediate. While the possibility of sovereignty is the precondition for corporate investment and speculation in the Sahrawi state, financialization also facilitates the achievement of the perceived imperative for sovereign states to participate in capitalist markets. The projection of a sovereign Sahrawi state in the context of the deferred contracts is not an attempt to relay a reading of the present for the future, but rather a way of knowing and valuing a future asset in the present. Evidence that supports or strengthens claims to a Sahrawi history and a distinctive Sahrawi identity in the territory is valuable, insofar as it may strengthen the perception of the contract's viability and, therefore, its value. For companies, such evidence may lend credence to Sahrawi claims and hopes for a referendum. I'll now turn to how these hopes have been articulated to possible investors. This day will come, and it will come soon. This was the closing sentence of Mohammed Qadad's announcement for the first oil and gas licensing initiative in London in 2005, formally inviting oil companies to engage the state in talks to secure licenses for oil and gas in the Sahrawi waters. The potential is great, Qadad declared. He commanded and promised the arrival of Sahrawi sovereignty, forming the basis of a stable horizon upon which the value of the contracts might be judged. At the time, Qadad was a member of the Sahrawi National Secretariat and was the Sahrawi coordinator for the UN mission responsible for organizing a referendum in Western Sahara. He spent much of his announcement highlighting favorable United States and British foreign trade statements on the conflict and detailing the promise the Sahrawi state was making to investors. These promises put forth an image of a respectable state, one that might tell us about the ideals of sovereignty itself. Qadad would go on to lay out the details of the Sahrawi territorial claims, providing a history of the territory by explaining its iterations of colonialism in Western Sahara for the potential investors. The preparation went beyond configuring knowledge about the territory and the qualities of the state. It also sought to define its citizens as ethnically, linguistically, and culturally distinct from their northern Moroccan neighbors. The competing histories that inform property creation in Western Sahara were echoed in Qadad's presentation to investors, as he countered Morocco's claims by outlining Sahrawi-authored historical and political claims. Purchasing oil and gas blocks for exploration is always a financial risk, regardless of the political climate. Exploration processes may fail to find oil. However, the Sahrawi context introduces another set of risks for investors, those related to the forecast of sovereignty. As Qadad's statement indicated, Sahrawi leaders sought to stabilize the perception of sovereign risk, or the risk of Sahrawi sovereignty never attaining, by offering a vision of a stable state that would rightfully and legally take territorial possession peacefully in an imminent future. While the Sahrawi state could not assure its potential investors that this future was sure to arrive soon, its representatives attempted to offer proof not only that sovereignty would be realized in the near future, but that the state was investment worthy and would be a good business partner. Qadad assured potential investors, "We are a government," he said, "which wants transparent and lawful relations with our neighbors and with international commerce. Today's announcement is to say welcome to international investors and companies who wish to work with us. Rest assured, commitments we make today will be respected tomorrow." Another Sahrawi Petroleum and Mining Authority representative explained that the contracts offered an avenue to prepare and to build the necessary skills for sovereignty through the growth of institutional and intellectual capacities of the state. Here, the contracts emerge as the terrain upon which leaders have sought to build skills and capabilities in the present. In a 2015 meeting in the lobby of a Paris hotel, a Sahrawi representative recounted these initial developments of the contract. He explained that the contracts offered a means to prepare for sovereignty and to demonstrate the state's fitness prior to sovereignty. However, it is not merely that sovereignty is something to be recognized. Rather, he posited it as a status that might be earned by establishing a track record of respect for international law and the free market. The Sahrawi constitution was updated in 2014 to add articles that enable officials to create legislation focused on the management of resources in the territory. It was not unusual for officials to direct me to these articles and the future of an open market economy when suggesting the Sahrawi state's readiness. A leader who was involved in the constitutional updates required for the contracts explained to me that Sahrawis will not need to start a state again when they become free. The law will be ready to use. The links between legal preparations and capacities for state governance were frequently paired with the issue of resources in conversations that I had with officials, youth activists, and in Sahrawi-authored publications. By deferring oil contracts, the Sahrawi state has projected a future that allowed for and necessitated the development of previously absent regulations. The development of these regulations has been paired with the claims of Sahrawi commitments to legality and subsequently integrated as evidence for earned sovereignty. By emphasizing the claim that theirs is a legal alternative, albeit delayed, to Morocco's illegality, Sahrawis have attempted to counter the Moroccan state's claims to the territory. In doing so, they construct a history of Sahrawi legality and economic logics for the future state to build a track record of capitalist engagement. However, the Sahrawi state continues to face new challenges, both political and environmental, that demand adaptation. Qadad, who opened the licensing initiatives and declared, Western Sahara open for business, passed away in April 2020 before his vision for Sahrawi-led future in Western Sahara could be realized, and 7 months before the collapse of the ceasefire agreement. While there are other representatives involved in the contracts, Qadad was at their center and periphery simultaneously. He moved between the contracts and his official role as the Sahrawi liaison to the UN. He was a leading diplomat in a way that seemed to give credence to the contracts, bringing the state and the struggle for decolonization together. His optimism was infectious and matched by a presence both measured and authoritative. Following Qadad's passing and the collapse of the ceasefire agreement, Sahrawi leadership has renewed its focus on defense and a return to armed conflict, which one representative who was unaffiliated with the contracts had previously suggested was necessary to avoid, lest it risk the state's business partnerships. However, the death of Qadad and the return to war has not been the only challenge to a Sahrawi market in fossil fuel extraction in Western Sahara. In recent years, Morocco has turned to Western Sahara as a potential site for the country's ambitious renewable energy and renewable manufacturing strategies. New plans aim to utilize the territory's expansive desert to generate the renewable energy necessary to produce green fertilizer without generating carbon emissions. Western Sahara's desert landscape offers a unique opportunity for the testing and scaling up of renewable-powered fertilizer manufacturing. To this end, the Moroccan state's green hydrogen offer includes 1 million hectares of land for investors seeking to build renewable projects in support of green hydrogen and green fertilizer production. You can see that offer on the screen right now. The public land on offer is graded in terms of its resource potential, with the entirety of Western Sahara's territory allocated to the highest grade, excellent potential, with the vast majority of Morocco's territory uncategorized altogether. The Moroccan green hydrogen offer firmly locates the infrastructure required to transform the world's largest phosphate reserves and the anticipated solution for climate-driven food insecurity in Western Sahara. While Sahrawis have successfully utilized legal proceedings to challenge non-renewable extraction in the territory, we don't yet know how these legal frameworks and sites of resistance will engage with the expansion of renewable resource industries and climate change technologies in the territory. Globally, a lack of attention to developing best practices for the design and development of renewable-based infrastructure and manufacturing on indigenous land and in non-self-governing territories like Western Sahara threaten to further the dispossession, while leading those like Sahrawis without the same legal pathways that they've successfully pursued for non-renewable resources. And with the demands for global transition from fossil fuels, there are new questions for the Sahrawi Republic. In 2021, the Sahrawi Office of the Prime Minister addressed the need for climate action and the tension with the deferred contracts in a broader analysis of climate and energy commitments, explaining that the contracts that I've been talking about today will be reviewed in the context of the Sahrawi state's commitment to achieving the Paris goals once the conflict has been resolved. Sahrawi refugees are deeply aware of how climate change impacts the livability of the camps, Temperature extremes grow more acute, with real questions about what it means to endure the heat while waiting for the referendum. Yet despite these challenges, the oil and gas contracts remain an important tool for preparing for sovereignty and countering Morocco. As it stands, there are no longer any active projects for oil and gas exploration or extraction in Western Sahara. While there has been a concerted multi-pronged strategy to stop Moroccan-led exploration, one official pointed to the Sahrawi contracts as a key component of blocking Moroccan-led activities, keeping oil and gas in the ground for the time being. Almost 20 years on from the initial offering, the contracts are still on offer for companies interested in choosing the anticipatory state and continue to provide opportunities in the present, regardless of what their future may hold. These contracts provide a way to bring the land and the state together through the mediation of the property. The contracts have facilitated the development of governance mechanisms, legislation, and business experience. They have served as a tool for the mediation of property and the assertion of the realness of the state itself, giving it a virtual territorial forum on which the state might exercise its craft. Pilots do prepare in simulators, after all. And I will go ahead and end that now. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Randy, for such a fascinating and rich presentation. There's so much that I'm going to be mulling over.